If you're driven by personally defined objectives and you're processing information within that construct, you're going to have a high probability of getting value from it. You're going to have a high probability of not being damaged by it. And that is sort of a good example of what it means to be a critical thinker.
Welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods, a podcast at the nexus of hospitality, business, culture, and the mind. Now here's your host, Woolco Foods CEO, Stephen Toberoff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. I am your host, Stephen Toberoff. And today I want to talk about something that I have reflected upon quite a bit lately and something I think that is essential for being effective in business and in life. In a sense, it's almost a sequel to a podcast I recorded several months ago called Throwing Away Your Personality, where I talked about the ego and our inner dialogue and all of the different things that go on inside of our mind and the way we create an identity and a personality and all these things to navigate life, and how that creates challenges and the benefits of getting rid of that entire dynamic to the extent that one can on a daily basis. And the reason this is kind of a sequel to that, if you will, is because once one is aware of that dynamic of personality and identity, and one can see it for what it is, which is a chimera, and then get rid of it, what one is left with is the capacity for critical thought. And I think there's absolutely nothing more important than being an effective business person and an effective human being, quite frankly, than the capacity to think critically for oneself. And I think for my experience, and I think most of you, if you look around and think about it yourselves, people who truly are capable of thinking critically and do so consistently are in very short supply. So I want to do a podcast on this today. It's something I've been thinking about, as I say, quite a bit. I was first introduced to the subject of what it means to be a critical thinker in a serious way when I entered the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago has a tradition called the Aims of Education Address, which is given to all entering first-year students. And the speaker my year was in the philosophy department. I believe it was Ted Cohen. I could be mistaken on that. I was not a philosophy major, but nonetheless, I believe Ted Cohen is the individual who gave the speech. But I certainly remember the content of the speech, where it was essentially, to boil down the essential point that the speaker was making, that at the time, the University of Chicago was known for being a university that really admired and utilized the great books of Western civilization, Shakespeare, Plato, on down through all of the history of the great books they were referred to. And the thrust of the speaker's speech, if you will, was that we as students are going to be presented with a lot of very impressive sounding names and in very impressive sounding texts with a lot of ideas. And while it's important to engage with these texts in a respectful manner and an open-minded manner, we should never be intimidated to challenge the suppositions contained within them, to ask questions, never check our intellect at the door, whether it's Kant, whether it's Aristotle, whomever. Engage with the texts as if you're really thinking about them, picking them apart, grappling with them, and ultimately reach your own conclusions based upon reason and analysis. And that speech had a big impact on me then. It's had a big impact on me through the rest of my life, because the ability to think critically is ultimately the linchpin for living a life of freedom and possibility. And without critical thinking, one is nothing more than a vassal to whatever stimuli they're subjected to, or whatever false inner dialogue they subject themselves to based upon a bunch of conscious and subconscious dynamics. So the point being that this was a speech that impacted me, and that really is the essence of what I want to explore a little bit here, critical thinking. What does it mean to be a critical thinker? What is required to be a critical thinker? What are the benefits of critical thinking? And why is it important in business and in life? So when I look at the state of the world today, which fundamentally may not be different than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago in terms of the fact that there have always been people in positions of authority that want to manipulate the masses, manipulate people as much as they can. These can be governments. These can be corporations that want you to buy what they're selling. These can be people that we actually know that simply want us to adhere to a pattern of behavior that's in their interests. But because of the way the world is structured now with social media and a multitude of different voices being thrust at us every day and voices that speak with authority and people seem to listen to them even though there's no authority behind it, I think it's more important than ever to be a critical thinker because, quite frankly, even if you were a lazy person, when I grew up, you were able to curate your own content just based upon the paucity of content that was available. Meaning, if it was a Saturday afternoon and I'm 12 years old in 1982, if there's nothing on television and you don't have any books that you're interested in reading and you're bored with the music you have, you really have no choice but to sort of engage with other people or maybe take a walk and think. But now in our cell phone and other devices, we're bombarded with people telling us all kinds of things. We're bombarded with people like celebrities who want to tell us how to vote. We're bombarded with corporations who use all kinds of tactics to try to get us to believe that if we purchase their product or service, it's going to be a totally transcendental and transformative experience. And there's no lack of access to what people may think is information, and in many cases it is information, but in many cases it's not information. It's just nonsense. And if you're not a critical thinker, you're going to be subjected to the nonsense. And if you're subjected to that and you're not aware of it, you're going to fall victim to it. So one of the tactics that people oftentimes use to manipulate people into thinking a certain way is celebrity. We can all think of celebrities who we know that opine on everything from how you should live your life vis-a-vis relationships, whether you should have children, who you should vote for, what's cool and what's not cool. But if we think critically and we look at the celebrity, whatever that means, it's just a human being who is famous primarily because some large corporate infrastructure that's behind them has pushed them in front of us. So whether it's an actor, whether it's an actress, does it really matter what they think about whether or not you should have children, what type of relationship you have, what your political views are? You know, maybe if you had a discussion with this person one-on-one and got to know them and it was a back and forth dialogue and you'd find out their background and their intelligence level and their sort of experience, it may make sense. But absent that, what's the value there? And I don't think there is much value there. I think it's a form of manipulation. What is fame even? You know, we saw that Taylor Swift just got married in Madison Square Garden. That's a very interesting choice of venue to get married at for somebody that wanted privacy. It's very interesting, the fact that there were people who actually subjected themselves to stand outside in the heat for hours and maybe days. They don't know Taylor Swift. They're not invited to the wedding. How does this benefit them? So the first thing is people will use fame. Sometimes you'll see people that are wealthy, people that are very wealthy, and they start opining about literature or politics, but their comments are totally ignorant. Their insights are totally simplistic or vulgar, but they believe that wealth confers an authority on them. So you can understand that there's all kinds of tactics out there that are used where people try to leverage dynamics that have absolutely nothing to do with the underlying content. What does that mean for a critical thinker? Well, if you're a critical thinker, you're not going to be impressed by anything other than the content that is being shared with you. So if somebody says to me something totally what I believe to be moronic or simplistic, the fact that it's Brad Pitt or Chelsea Handler or Michael Jordan, that's not going to matter to me. because the underlying content of what is being expressed is what I have to reflect on. Does this make sense? If it does, why? If it doesn't, why? What is the purpose of this individual trying to share this information with me? So when we go about our day, and this is kind of ironic because I'm doing a podcast, but my podcast is encouraging people to think critically about what I'm saying. Maybe you disagree with it. I always end my podcasts, and I'm very often treated with people sending me emails where they disagree with things I've said, and I've loved it. And sometimes those disagreements have led me to change my perspective. So the first thing as a critical thinker is really ask yourself, what's going on here? Don't be embarrassed to ask questions. Don't worry about how you look. If you're being given information in a given setting, especially if it's business, let's say you're in a room of people and you're about to onboard a very expensive piece of technology that's designed to help you drive sales or to improve the order flow in your restaurant or whatever it is. And you have your managers there, the people who are selling you the tech are there, and you have questions. You have to ask the question, I'm sorry, that doesn't make sense. Can you please explain it to me again? If you find yourself not asking questions because you're embarrassed, because you don't want to look a certain way, because you're concerned how people might perceive you for asking questions, that's the opposite of critical thinking. Critical thinking requires questioning a lot of things a lot of the time and publicly questioning things and not caring about how we think other people will perceive us. That's a big part of it. You have to also be open-minded, meaning when you go into a certain set of circumstances, particularly if you're gathering data for your business, but it could just be for life, be open-minded to what a person is actually saying, even if it conflicts with what you believe, even if it conflicts with the way you think things are supposed to be. If you're not open-minded, it's going to be virtually impossible to learn. You're going to be a slave to the personality that you've crafted, or you're going to be a slave to this notion of wanting to be perceived a certain way. One of the strategies that I've used to ensure that I'm engaged in critical thinking, especially within the business context, is in every meaningful conversation and every meaningful initiative, and really as part of my fundamental strategic infrastructure, I develop personal, clear, definable objectives to me that are completely results-oriented. So if we want to expand it outside the business, when you're listening to information from a podcast, from a magazine article, from an interview, I always ask myself, is this going to help increase my knowledge? Is this going to educate me? Is this going to increase my wisdom? Is this going to help me develop strategies to make more money? Is this going to help me develop strategies to improve my physical fitness or my nutrition? So if you have a desire going into things, then you can process the information you're receiving within that pre-established framework, rather than just listening to George Clooney talk to the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, about the future of hospitality. And they might be saying things that are total nonsense that are maybe good for Apple's business or good for Casamigos, but may not be accurate. Or George Clooney may have something incredibly insightful to say. And because you don't like him as an actor or you don't like Casamigos, you're not open-minded and you shut it off. If you're driven by personally defined objectives and you're processing information within that construct, you're going to have a high probability of getting value from it. You're going to have a high probability of not being damaged by it. And that is sort of a good example of what it means to be a critical thinker. You know, some other tactics are, and this is very easy, one of the best and easiest ways that people are manipulated is they get activated emotionally by things that are not emotional. Even something as foolish as saying, I don't like that movie, I don't like that baseball team, I don't like that politician. So what? And yet people get immensely activated emotionally. So whenever you find yourself having a conversation that's substantive, can be about business, can be about trying to improve your life, it can be about making a big financial decision, and you find yourself getting emotional in any type of way, you really need to be aware of that and then deconstruct it. Because the minute you get emotional, a multitude of things occur that stop critical thinking in its tracks. You might get defensive. You might get upset. You might get frightened. You might get angry. And all of these things are going to dampen the power of your intellect to really process and question and understand the underlying content. Again, let's say I'm looking to go buy some new sound system for my home, and a person is explaining it. And then they say, but this is really for people with sophisticated ears, and it's quite expensive, so it may not be. And you're somebody that says, hey, wait a minute, is he saying I don't know how to listen to things with a sophisticated ear? I've been listening to music forever. Or is he saying I don't have the money to buy this? You're distracted. It's not relevant. If you like what's being presented, you'd say, no, that's fine. I have a question. How does this work in this situation? What do I have to do in that situation? This may seem obvious, but I think if people are honest with themselves, I know if I'm honest with myself, I used to be a very reactive person, very rich inner dialogue going on all times, very defensive. And although I could toggle with it, it was around way too much. And so I'm using very simple examples here, but they're extremely important if we want to activate the capacity for critical thinking. When you find yourself getting emotional based solely upon information people are giving you or based solely on the opinions they express, you need to take a step back and recognize that that's a negative concept. Another thing that happens all the time and is a great way for people to be manipulated, it's kind of how it's done in our political system, and it's how they corral people, in a sense, into two political parties, is people believe that their ideas are their identity. Well, I've always believed this. Everyone in my family has always believed this. This is who we are. You're no longer thinking. You're being herded like a thoughtless farm animal into a position. Your ideas are not your identity. Your ideas are one of a few things. They're either something that you've come up with in furtherance of a goal. Let's keep it within the context of business, but we can extrapolate it to any context we want. If you have some ideas on how to improve sales in your restaurant, in your bar, in your business, and you're driven to achieve that objective, and you think they're great ideas, and somebody who is much more knowledgeable than you comes to you and says, hey, wait a minute, there's 3 major flaws in your idea that if you execute on this idea, you're going to have major problems. And you immediately become defensive and shut down and say, how dare this person do this? Or an even better example, let's say somebody who doesn't own any restaurants or somebody who you think is in an inferior position to you, but they're not, and they challenge your idea. And you immediately say, hey, wait a minute, who's this guy or gal to say something to me? I have X, Y, and Z expertise. And you shut down and you don't listen. You're being controlled by yourself needlessly. Or we mentioned the political context. When people vote for anyone in office, I think the most rational thing is to first and foremost critically analyze for themselves what they think is best for themselves, their community, their family, their country. Not what a celebrity tells you to think, not what a musician tells you to vote for, not what you want to tell people that you're friends with, but people in elected office are public servants. They're not going to sit at your dinner table. Your life's not going to get better just because X person wins instead of Y person. It's the policies that they put forth. Are those policies in alignment with your goals? We're blessed to live in the United States of America where we can pursue happiness. If an individual hasn't established some goals for themselves in this country that they want to achieve and then benchmark policy proposals of political candidates against those goals, what are you voting for? That's within the political context. We can talk about within the consumption context. If you're somebody that's looking to have a meaningful and a rich and an enjoyable life, and you happen to have wealth, and people are telling you, well, if you have X number of dollars, you need this sports car, and you buy it, and you don't feel good. Or you need this type of vacation, and you go on it. Or you get this type of watch, and none of it is satisfying to you. That's not a shock. Those are products that are sold by corporations designed to make money. Now, if you're somebody who's an absolute fanatic about watches and every time you get a new watch with a great complicated movement, like for me, I genuinely enjoy collecting, among other things, historical signatures and comic books. I don't do it because I can afford it. I don't do it because I want to look cool to other people who do it. For whatever reason, these things are of interest to me, among the many hobbies I have. So I'm not suggesting that people who collect cars or buy watches, it's ipso facto bad. But what I am saying is when it comes to generating and creating for yourself a life that is truly nourishing and rich, you have to determine for yourself what makes it so. And if you don't do that through critical thought, through honest self-assessment, you'll just be manipulated into buying and doing things that just reinforce your emptiness, take your money, and they don't really do anything. It just, puts you back in the loop. So you have to understand that this is a process where you have to be critical, not just with the outside world, but with yourself. What is it that you want to do and what's important to you? And again, I'm going to go back to this because this is so important. Asking questions. In every context, especially if you're looking to achieve an objective, your only priority is truly understanding the information that is being given to you thoroughly. And if you don't, keep asking questions. And if the questions don't thoroughly answer what you seek to achieve, then you have to keep asking things. And don't be afraid to change your mind if information comes along that illuminates you to something you didn't think of before. This is why I don't debate with people. Never have a debate. Because when you debate, I have a law degree, right? I went to law school. I passed the bar exam. So I understand all about advocacy and trying to win and all that stuff. That's not of interest to me in life. When I have a conversation with somebody, I want to hear their perspective. I want to see what they're saying. I want to listen to it. I want to process it. I especially love having conversations with people who have a different perspective than I do on certain subjects, because oftentimes at the end of a very rich and meaningful discussion with an intelligent and open-minded person, either my perspective will have changed based on information I didn't have or hadn't thought of, or their perspective will change. So ask a lot of questions and be willing to be open-minded. And if information comes along or life circumstances come along, the priorities you might have politically, I use politics because it's a very good example of how they try to mass herd people into behaviors, but it doesn't have to just be, look, let's talk consumerism or let's talk art. The things that you may have enjoyed as a 25-year-old are different than the things that you enjoy as a 35-year-old. The things that are important to you at 25 are different than the things that are important to you at 35. But if you refuse to change because you somehow think that you're committing some form of self-immolation of your identity, you're deluding yourself. Now, here's the good news, although it's got a little bit of a challenge with it, but not much of one as far as I'm concerned. If you develop the capacity for critical thinking, you will be in the minority and you will have a substantial advantage over almost everyone else that you interact with in business and elsewhere. Most people either will not think critically because they're just psychologically too afraid to be perceived or what they think will be perceived a certain way. They're too afraid to deviate from the herd. They never had the confidence to think for themselves. They never had the confidence to make a mistake or have people think they're stupid because they're asking a question when in fact the stupidest thing is to not ask a question. Most people are not going to do this. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing, because obvious reasons. If you're dealing with somebody who's not a critical thinker, they're highly reactive. Once you size that up, you understand what you're dealing with. It's also a great thing because it enables you to go through life and work to achieve your goals in a context where the competition is less substantial. So do not get frustrated once you recognize, as you become a much more disciplined and critical thinker, when you recognize that most people are not like this. It's just the way that it is. And you're not going to fix them, but at the same time, if you're aware of it, it can be quite advantageous. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, who I really like, although I disagree with his pessimism, he writes in The Wisdom of Life and other maxims how to be self-contained and to be, sort of in your own mind, even when you're in crowds, even when you're with other people. So as you develop the capacity to be a true critical thinker and to really make decisions for yourself and to really ask questions, to really evaluate life and develop your own value system, don't allow it to make you totally disgusted with society and all of that. Recognize that even in society and when you're around people who are just, for me, and I'm sure other people have this experience, I don't like small talk at all. Sometimes I'll be invited to a social event or something and I'll go and people are talking about things that I find to be completely banal and foolish. Schopenhauer goes into this with far greater eloquence and humor than I ever could. But suffice it to say, for those people, sometimes they're called introverts. You get into a dynamic like this and you'll know what I'm talking about. Don't allow it to make you bitter or unhospitable. Just be at peace in your own mind and recognize that not everybody thinks the same way and not everybody is going to look at things the same way. But the most important thing from a business perspective, because it's a business podcast, is if you have the capacity and the discipline to think critically, you're going to have an immense advantage over your competition. Because then you're going to be able to use true strategy to achieve or at least work towards your objectives. There's a phenomenal book that I just read called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And in that book, it really defines what strategy is as opposed to vision boards and corporate culture and stretch goals and all of that. And one of the many lessons that I've taken from that book is if you're not a critical thinker, it's almost impossible to develop and execute on a strategy. And most businesses don't. But if you're one of them that do, I think it gives a tremendous advantage and will be much appreciated by everyone in your organization. And then my final suggestion for myself as well as for anyone who's listening and finds value in this is on a daily basis, I try to take some time to just reflect and look at some of the decisions I've made, some of the choices I've made, some of the initiatives I'm pursuing. Reflect on what's going on. Allow your mind to just drift. Reflect on what you're reading if you're somebody who likes to read, or reflect on information you got from a podcast. Another benefit of the world we live in, and I sometimes fall into this trap because this is why I have to consciously make time and deliberately take time to think and reflect and just let my mind drift, because there is so much access to content nowadays, which is phenomenal with the Kindle and podcasts. And I'm somebody who loves to read and I love to learn. And I almost developed this bad habit that if I'm not consuming content, I'm somehow wasting time. Like if I'm not exercising and I'm not working on my business and I'm not dealing with my family, then I should be consuming content. And I, again, reflected on myself, thought about it and said, that's actually not that smart, because if we don't take time to really reflect on and process and think about and integrate what we've learned from anywhere, other people, books, podcasts, movies, whatever it is. So I consciously take time to really just allow my mind to drift. And if I find myself just taking 20, 30 minutes in my office at home thinking or going for a walk, I don't view that as wasted time anymore. I view that as necessary to truly get the best out of what I'm learning and investing my time in doing. I think also, and this is kind of related to it, but I really try to reflect on those decisions that I made that had favorable outcomes and other decisions that had outcomes that were not what I wanted. And I really try to analyze what happened there, because the things that work, I want to replicate. And sometimes we'll foolishly give ourselves credit for thinking that it was, and this has happened with me, during periods of time, we've had massive sales growth. And I foolishly and may have just said, hey, man, we're really kicking ass. When in reality, that sales growth was 70, 80% reflection of exogenous forces. The Knicks on a championship run, the reopening after COVID, phenomenal weather. And conversely, there are times when I've made decisions and circumstances didn't get the outcome I wanted. That was also by exogenous factors. But other times it is a reflection of, hey, that was a great strategy. That approach of measuring activity in alignment with the strategy or the goal really worked. Let's take that same blueprint and superimpose it on this other department that we want to see an improvement in. Or you know what? Your approach here really didn't work. And it didn't work for XYZ reason. So as we take up another challenge, let's not repeat it. We have to reflect on ourselves, learn from ourselves so we can double down on what works and avoid what doesn't. And then finally, just really take pleasure in the fact of how expansive and how multidimensional our own minds and our own thinking can be. You know, the mind is an incredible instrument, going even beyond critical thinking. We process information and we create reality simultaneously. You know, Kant talks about this in the Critique of Reason, but, you know, on the one hand, when we're walking down a street and we see a tree, we process, hey, this is a tree. It's 20 feet in front of us. We have to move to the right so we don't walk into the tree. And that's our mind's doing that. But consciously or subconsciously, we could look at a tree as we're doing that and say, hey, that tree reminds me of when I was 10 years old and I rode my bike on this country road and I almost skinned my knee on this tree, or a host of other stuff. That's not reality. That's our mind superimposing a dimension on something, but yet the superimposition onto that thing creates its own reality. And the superimposition part of the whole process is an iterative process. And that's something we can take control of. And so the more we take control of that iterative process of our thinking in our mind, the more we can create the type of reality that we want. It's an incredible gift. And I really try to just take time and let my mind just go and think and be aware of metacognition and what thoughts are coming up and all that. So in any event, I wanted to have this podcast. It's been on my mind. I'm glad that I did. As always, if you enjoyed this content, I would appreciate it if you'd recommend it to other people you think would enjoy it. It's always very beneficial if people leave comments or rate the podcast. I especially enjoy it when people send me emails. You can email me at steven@woolcofoods.com. If you disagree with what I'm saying, or you have additional thoughts on what I've said or things you would modify, elaborate on, I've received tremendous benefit from interactions with people. I had a conversation with a very well-respected, now retired attorney who told me how much she enjoyed the podcast, Throw Away Your Personality. And this is someone who's not even in the food service business and not in business anymore in general. And she and I had a wonderful discussion, which prompted me to work on this podcast. I've had people write me emails where they completely disagree with almost everything that I say, and I love those as well. So love to hear from people. You can email me at steven@woolcofoods.com. You can DM me at woolcofoods. Always love to hear from people. And other than that, everybody have an awesome, awesome day.
Thank you for listening to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. Please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And to learn more about Woolco Foods or Steven Toberoff, please visit us at woolcofoods.net.